Good morning, everyone, and welcome from this side of the world. Buenos días para todas y para todos. Si usted habla español, asegúrese de seleccionar el canal de interpretación en el pequeño globo que encontrará en la parte inferior de la pantalla. La reunión se desarrollará en inglés, entonces de esta manera usted podrá escuchar todo lo dicho en español. So we will give a couple of more minutes, waiting to have more people joining us, and then we will be starting. Thank you so much. Well, hello everyone again. My name is Viviana Osorio, and I have the privilege of serving as a co-chair of the Women's Working Group of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. This event is convened jointly by the Forbes Women's Alliance and the Women's Working Group of the Earth Roundtable with the support of the First Freedom Foundation. We are deeply grateful for all of you joining us today from different parts of the world. Nuevamente en español, para quienes se nos han unido, recuerden que deben seleccionar el canal español en el globito que encuentran en la parte de abajo para que puedan escuchar toda la reunión en su idioma. Muchas gracias. So before we begin, I'd like to share about the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, often called the Earth Roundtable. This is a global multi-stakeholder network that brings together civil society organizations, faith actors, policymakers, and experts working to advance freedom of religion or belief for all. And within this big network, the Women's Working Group focuses specifically on the intersection between freedom of religion or belief and women's rights. Our goal is to ensure that the lived experiences of women, particularly women from religious minority communities, are not invisible in international discussions on either gender equality or religious freedom. In the context of CSW70, our working group submitted a written statement to the Commission on the Status of Women, documenting cases of violations of freedom or religion or belief affecting women, as well as patterns of discrimination and violence faced by women from religious minority communities in different regions. This statement was supported by 23 organizations, reflecting a broad coalition of actors committed to advancing both gender equality and freedom of religion or belief. Among them are organizations such as the For Women's Alliance, Jubilee Campaign, Open Doors, the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America, BPSOS, Big Ocean Women, and many others who continue to work tirelessly to bring visibility to these issues. It is then a pleasure to welcome you all to this parallel event, Closing the Gap, Access to Justice for Women from Religious Minority Communities, which takes place in the context of the 70th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, and at a particularly significant moment, the broader context of the Beijing Plus 30 review and ongoing efforts to accelerate progress on gender equality. This invites us to reflect on progress, but also on the gaps that remain in the realization of women's rights around the world. One of those persistent gaps concerns access to justice. 30 years ago, the Beijing Platform for Action affirmed an important principle that continues to guide global efforts for gender equality. In paragraph 12, the platform recognizes that the empowerment and advancement of women includes the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief, acknowledging that these freedoms contribute to the moral, ethical, spiritual, and intellectual lives of women and men, both individually and in community with others, and enable them to realize their full potential in society and shape their lives according to their own aspirations. This recognition is significant because it reminds us that freedom of religion or belief is not external to the women's rights agenda. On the contrary, it is recognized as an integral dimension of women's empowerment and human dignity, and part of the broader framework of rights envisioned in Beijing. Yet 30 years later, an important question, like many important questions remain. What happens when women, particularly women from religious minority communities, are still unable to access justice when those rights are violated? What can be done to ensure effective access to remedies and reparations for them? What are the obligations of states to address these violations? And how can stronger solidarity and collaboration be built across civil society, international mechanisms, and governments to ensure that states are held accountable? And these are some of the questions that guide our conversation today. All this said, let me briefly walk you through the flow of today's conversation. We will begin with a keynote intervention by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Professor Nasila Ganea, who will help frame the global picture of the justice gaps affecting women from religious minority communities and reflect on the obligations of states under international human rights law. Following the keynote, we will move into a regional panel discussion, bringing together perspectives from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we are really honored to also be joined today by Wei Wei Nu from Women's Peace Network, representing Asia, Funky Aduye, founder of Hope Behind Bars Africa, and Teresa Flores from the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America, UNLIRE. After the panel, we will open the conversation to the audience with moderated questions and discussion before concluding with a brief reflection on key takeaways and call to action. All this say, I will now pass the floor to Judy Golub, who is part of the For Women's Alliance, who are one of the conveners of this event. So, Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Viviana. For Women's Alliance is pleased to have organized Closing the Gap. And I'm Judy Golub, one of the Alliance's co-founders. I want to call out my fellow co-founder, Luann Sabatier, for the many wonderful contributions. So what's For Women Alliance and what does it do? The Alliance seeks to increase the impact of existing initiatives that focus on the intersection of women and freedom of religion and belief forward. By connecting and collaborating with individuals and organizations across sectors, we seek to break down the silos to help people more effectively work together on the pressing issues facing women, their communities, and the freedom of the religion they believe. To find out more about FORB Women, please go to forbwomen.org. So what is FORB? FORB is a right of conscience that affords every individual the ability to have, adopt, change, and express any religion or belief or none, including expressing differing interpretation or dissents within traditions. Properly used, let me underscore, properly used, FORB empowers human beings as individuals and in community with others, and is a gateway right as it is closely associated with other essential rights, including assembly, expression, and association. It thus plays a pivotal role in achieving gender equality, empowering women and girls, and access to justice. So how does FORB empower people? By influencing attitudes and cultural norms and helping shape behaviors, practices, policy, and laws. FORB thus is an essential tool to help women and girls overcome barriers perpetrated by governments and non-state actors, and those barriers that are often hidden inside houses and within communities. Often cloaked in cultural and social norms and stereotypes that can masquerade often as religious dicta, these barriers include discriminatory laws, underrepresentation in decision-making, the absence of economic opportunity, and limitations on educational attainment and access to healthcare and economic, social, and political participation. Now, we know that governments and societies that respect FORB thus create public and private spheres where issues can be discussed, and that full respect for FORB enables women to interpret and publicly express their beliefs and challenge religious and other justification for violation of their human and other rights. Now, what are some of the facts on the ground that makes convening so important today? One, women are not a minority. We account for over half the world's population, a world in which 80% live in countries that violate people's freedom of religion or belief. Now, dictators, autocrats, non-state actors, and others seeking to maintain or acquire power understand that women and girls have power because we're key to their community's past, present, and future. They thus use all their tools at their disposal to target women and girls, especially those belonging to religious minority communities. Two, women and girls from these communities, as well as the centers of religious majority communities, face compound persecution and harassment, multiple deprivations, and structural violence because of their gender and religion. Now, I would be remiss, especially today, if I did not add that the dislocations and devastation caused by genocide, war, displacement, and forced migration put significant barriers in the way of achieving FORB, empowering women, and accessing justice. Now, today's convening will highlight a condition in many parts of the world, including in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but I want to call out especially concerning conditions in the Middle East, given the perilous state of women, for instance, under the Taliban in Afghanistan, Christian and Baha'is in Iran, Yazidi and others in Iraq, and Christian and other religious minorities in Syria, to name just a few. So three, as I noted earlier, the lack of relationships and collaborations between people working in FORB and other areas, including gender equality and human rights, has led to isolated, silent, and therefore weaker networks. Yet these rights are not contradictory. In fact, viewing them as such violates the universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of human rights, which must be understood holistically. Four, women, despite compound vulnerabilities and barriers, have accomplished a great deal. Just look at our speakers today and what they have accomplished. Finally, number five, access to justice is essential if women, especially those from religious minority communities, will experience gender equality, freedom of religion or belief, and other essential rights. So I'm excited today about today's program, where we'll hear more about facts on the ground and proactive strategies for change. So I look forward to a lively and informative discussion. So Viviana, back to you.
Well, thank you, Judy, for helping us frame the conversation, and also for the leadership of the Four Women's Alliance in bringing together organizations working at the intersection of women's rights and FORB. Something very important to highlight about what Judy has just said is that many women, and particularly those belonging to religious minorities, often face compounded forms of discrimination, where gendered discrimination and violations of freedom of religion or belief intersect and reinforce one another, often resulting in exclusion, violence, and significant barriers for seeking protection or justice. And it is precisely this intersection and the urgent need to address these layered injustices that brings us to today's conversation. It is therefore my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Nasila Ganea, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Professor Ganea, she is professor of international human rights law at the University of Oxford and an internationally recognized expert on freedom of religion or belief. In her role as a special rapporteur, she works closely with states, civil society, and international institutions to address violations of this right and strengthen protections for vulnerable communities around the world. Professor Ganea, we are deeply honored by your presence today. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Viviana. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I really appreciate this important conversation during the Commission on the Status of Women. It's a privilege to join Wei, Funke, Teresa, and those who are working tirelessly on the ground to advance justice and equality, to bring visibility to the lived realities of women, including those belonging to religion and belief minority communities. And that advocacy is critical in expanding pathways to justice. This intersection of several international commitments and bringing it into focus, how they relate across the Commission on the Status of Women, Beijing Plus 30, and freedom of religion or belief, and access to justice is really critical. Access to justice, we know, is not just a procedural concern. It's a core component of the protection of all human rights, including from freedom of religion or belief. Without it, individuals can't seek protection from discrimination or violence, and rights become hollow and meaningless. And for women from religious minority communities, the barriers to justice, as we've heard, are multiple and intersecting. They face discrimination because of their gender, because of their religion or belief, often also intersecting with other factors such as poverty, maybe poor education, and other denials and vulnerabilities, situations of vulnerability that they might find themselves in. So when it comes to reporting abuses, accessing remedies, or obtaining protection from the authorities, there are profound obstacles. And worse still, referring to the authorities or seeking justice from the authorities may lead to yet more abuse by those authorities. This mandate over its 40 years has observed that women from religion or belief minorities really tangibly experience compound discrimination. And that's why 3 of the reports of this mandate, 3 thematic reports, address gender and freedom of religion or belief. In fact, other than hate speech, it's the only topic that has received attention time and again in this mandate. The harms, of course, arise when gender discrimination intersects with restrictions or hostility related to religion or belief. And I want to pause here to recall that by freedom of religion or belief, I mean the 3 dimensions of it. So one is the narrower, yet of course crucial importance of freedom of religion or belief in and of itself, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, hence the right to have, adopt, and change religion or belief, and to manifest it, including in public and with others. The first part cannot be restricted under any circumstance. The second may be restricted, may be limited by the authorities, but must be according to the limitations framework and strictly according to that framework. Otherwise, manifestation as a whole will be erased. Across Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, everywhere, women from religious minority communities face harassment, violence, and social exclusion in the name of their religion or due to their religion. So we have the core freedom of religion or belief in Article 18. Then we have discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief. So that's discrimination with regards to any human right. So when people are targeted because of their religion or belief, including religious minority women, then it's their education, their health, their equality before the law, their freedom of movement, their family rights, all of them can be restricted merely due to their religion. And the third dimension that plays out an important role, and already Viviana and Judy in passing referenced it, is violations in the name of religion. So there are denials of human rights, restrictions or violations of human rights, allegedly in the name of religion, often abused in order to harass and violate the rights of women even further. Now, when it comes to gender-based barriers that prevent religious minority women from accessing justice, the barriers can take many forms. These are in personal status laws. They may be in relation to blasphemy. It may be lack of recognition, including in relation to personal status laws, lack of documentation and IDs, or intimidation and retaliation. So women have to navigate both the pressure from a wider society, but also those from within their communities. So this can include honor killings, shame-based violations, as they've been called, fear, stigma, community retaliation, or family repercussions. And they're hugely burdensome. So when institutions lack independence or sensitivity, then it's even more likely that a meaningful remedy becomes even more remote and difficult. So the core challenge we're discussing today is structural accountability gaps within national justice systems, and perhaps even in international law, there is still work to be done to make visible all the gaps and challenges faced by minorities. So formal equality may exist in the law, but it is still far from being delivered, including a substantive equality especially, remain inaccessible and unachievable because of discrimination, bias, lack of legal aid, fear of retaliation, or lack of effective remedies. And the social norms themselves silence women or discourage them from seeking the little justice that they may have access to. Prevailing attitudes about gender roles and religious and belief prejudice, discrimination, and structural restrictions normalize that discrimination and minimize the harms experienced by minority women. Now, we know that the international legal frameworks of CEDAW, the ICCPR, the SDGs, and Beijing all should be supporting this topic that we're addressing today. International human rights law has clear guidance, and these hard law and soft law instruments reiterates that. I won't go through it, but of course we have Article 18 of CEDAW, we have Article 18 of the ICCPR, we have Article 2 of CEDAW and other critical standards there, and in the Beijing Platform for Action, we should be getting more support, and in the SDGs, Goal 5 and 16 and others are highly relevant. I don't know if any of you were at the Beijing Women's Conference. I was, and at that time, it had to be reiterated that women's rights are human rights, And today we have to draw attention to and reiterate, even though it's long been established in those normative standards, we have to remind that freedom of religion or belief too is a woman's human rights. Now, the mandate has had numerous communications on this matter and frequently addresses it, brings it into focus in country reports as well as thematic reports. But I just wanted to highlight one such allegation letter, and that's ALBRA 2/2023, that addressed the freedom of religion or belief of indigenous women. And it related to the Guarani and Kaiwo indigenous peoples in Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, particularly women spiritual leaders and human rights defenders, and the systematic violence, threats, harassment, and discrimination that they faced. So that was not only a restriction on their freedom of religion or belief, but also of their gender rights, cultural rights, freedom of expression, and others. So I feel we're running out of time, so let me just highlight a number of publications that exist that address this in far more detail. One is by the Danish Institute for Human Rights that address freedom of religion or belief and women's rights within the framework of the SDGs. It was the result of very extensive multi-stakeholder consultations and synthesized really those consultations over a number of sessions. And there's another one that is very accessible. It's from the Stephanus Alliance on Women and Freedom of Religion or Belief. USERF also has publications, including on women and religious freedom, synergies and opportunities, and another one on the role of women in advancing international religious freedom. So I had some points about practical reform priorities, but let me just end by saying that the closing of the equality gap in accessing to justice requires our sustained commitment from states, international institutions, civil society, and communities themselves in order to finally get to a place where we can ensure that no woman is denied protection, remedy, or justice because of her gender, her minority status, or her religion or belief. I look forward to the insights that will now be shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nasila. It's been wonderful to hear your reflections on this, in particular, how important it is to promote a stronger interdependence on women's rights and FORB, and how the FORB violations against women also intersects with broader rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights. And we really look forward to hear more about the policy recommendations you may have for us today after the panel. We will be very excited to hear your reactions also to what the panelists will be sharing with us. And now we will move to the regional panel, where we will hear perspectives from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Our panelists will share their insights from the regions on the barriers that women from religious minority communities face in accessing justice, as well as policy recommendations for addressing these challenges. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. First, joining us from Asia, we have Wei Nu. Wei Nu is the founder and executive director of the Women's Peace Network and a globally recognized advocate for democracy, peace building, and human rights in Myanmar. After spending 7 years as a political prisoner, she emerged as a powerful voice for the rights of marginalized communities, particularly the Rohingya, and for women's leadership in peace and democratic movements. Her work has received international recognition, including honors such as the End Peace Award and the Impact Hero Award for the Obama Foundation, among others. Our second panelist representing Africa is Funke Adoye. She's the founder and executive director of Hope Behind Bars Africa. Funke Adoye is a Nigerian human rights lawyer and a leading advocate for access to justice across Africa. Through Hope Behind Bars Africa, she has provided legal assistance to thousands of incarcerated and marginalized individuals while advancing reforms aimed at strengthening justice systems and expanding access to legal representation. Her work has received international recognition, including the International Bar Association's Outstanding Young Lawyer Award in 2025. And finally, in representing Latin America, we are very pleased to welcome Teresa Flores from the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America, OLIRE. Teresa Flores is a Peruvian lawyer specializing in freedom of religion or belief in Latin America. She holds a law degree from the Santo Toribio de Mogrovejo Catholic University in Peru and a diploma in religious studies from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. She serves as a director of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America and is a member of the Latin American Consortium of Religious Freedom, where she contributes to research, publications, and advocacy documenting discrimination and hostilities affecting religious communities across the region. We are grateful to all the three of our panelists for joining us today and for bringing these important regional perspectives. So let me now invite Wei Wei-Nu to begin by sharing insights from Asia.
Thank you, Viviana. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Wei Wei-Nu. I'm the founder and executive director of Women's Peace Network and a human rights advocate from Myanmar. For more than a decade, my work has focused on advancing justice, accountability, and protections for women and marginalized communities affected by the conflict and systematic discriminations. Today, it is a pleasure to focus on this critical issue of the persistence gap and challenges in access to justice for women in Myanmar. Access to justice is a fundamental human right. It means that individuals who experience harm can seek protections, accountability, and remedy through fair and functioning institutions. But for many women in Myanmar, particularly those from ethnic and religious minorities, communities, justice remains distant, inaccessible, or entirely absent. There are several interconnected reasons for this. First, Myanmar has long struggled with a deep entrenched culture of impunity. For decades, the military has exercised extraordinary power without meaningful oversight or accountability. It has created a system where serious crimes, including sexual violence, are rarely investigated and even more rarely prosecuted. Women have often been among the most affected by this culture of impunity. In conflict-affected regions across the country, sexual violence has been repeatedly used as a tactic of intimidation and control, basically as a weapon of war. Women from ethnic minority communities, including Kachin, Karen, Shan, Chin, and Rohingya community have documented and reported these cases of rape, sexual assault, and other forms of violence committed during the military's operations. However, survivors rarely have access to legal recourse. Many fear retaliation, if they speak out. Others lack the financial resources, legal knowledge, or safe reporting channels necessary to pursue justice. A second major barrier is the weakness and lack of independence within the Myanmar judicial systems. For many years, the court have not operated as independent institutions capable of holding powerful actors accountable. Cases involving the military or politically sensitive issues are rarely handled transparently or fairly, or even brought to their court. Survivors who attempt to pursue legal actions often encounter bureaucratic barriers, delays, intimidations, and threats. Since the military coup in 2021, the situation has become even more severe. The rule of law has further deteriorated. The judicial institutions are widely viewed as instrument of political control rather than guardian of justice. Lawyers, activists, and civil society organizations working to support survivors face harassment, surveillance, and arrest. These environments make it extremely difficult for women to safely report abuses or pursue legal remedies. Third, social and cultural barriers also play a significant role. In many communities, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence face stigma and discriminations. Reporting violence brings shames to families and communities, and women may be pressured to remain silent. As a result, many incidents of violence goes unreported. Survivors often carry a burden of trauma without support or recognition. These barriers are even more pronounced for women from religious minorities community. Religious identity in Myanmar is often overlapped with ethnic identity, which means that discriminations can occur on multiple levels simultaneously. Women from minority communities may face barriers related not only to gender, but also ethnicity, language, religion, and geographic isolation. The experience of Rohingya community illustrated these overlapping challenges. Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic minority from Rakhine State who have faced decades of systematic discriminations, persecutions, and exclusion. My community, the Rohingya, denied or stripped of citizenship, restricted from movement, excluded from many aspect of public life for decades. The effect on the women's are severe on during these persecutory period. In 2017, a large-scale military operations resulted in mass displacement, forced displacement, and widespread violence, whereas it resulted in nearly 1 million people to leave from Burma within a couple of months. Many Rohingya women reported experiencing brutal forms of sexual violence during these attacks. This case has been discussed last month before the International Court of Justice. The accounts of sexual violence were also heavily discussed during the oral argument by the Gambia legal team. Today, majority of these Rohingya survivors live as refugees outside of Myanmar, particularly in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. For these women, access to justice is extraordinarily complex. The crimes they experience occurred in Myanmar across borders. Perpetrators remain largely beyond reach, and judicial systems in Myanmar is currently unable to provide meaningful accountability, or even if there is a capable judiciary systems for women, like I discussed earlier, women from minority communities, religious minorities, face many other challenges to access judicial systems or access to justice in Myanmar. So just to briefly, I would also like to highlight how other women from the religious minority communities are facing ongoing insecurity in Burma. Since the coup in 2021, armed conflict has expanded across many parts across the country, including areas affected by the area lived by the ethnic and religious minorities. The military has launched many forms of brutal violence against these ethnic and religious minorities that is resulting the further displacement, violence, and economic hardship to the sexual violence. So the country is now at the brink of a collapse, without having survivors having no access to justice or legal recourse or even other forms of support. Yet despite these challenges, women across the country continue to play a critical role in pursuing justice and accountability. And many women organizations and women-led organizations continue to pressure domestic actor other than the military to create an enable environment for women survivors of their sexual violence in the conflict-affected areas to have some level of access to justice. So to summarize, yes, we have a history, we have the many challenges, but the access to justice in Myanmar at the moment is simply absent. And in the meantime, there are a few things that we can actually do. Basically, one of the area that I would like to highlight to close this discussion today is the legal assistance and legal aid for survivors of the sexual violence and survivors of the religious freedom violation, especially when it's come to sexual and gender-based violence, as we are discussing, focusing this week on this issue. Despite the challenges in the legal systems within and outside, what we are seeing is the insufficient support for the legal representations, legal aid for these survivors, insufficient funding, insufficient lawyers. So I think if we are approaching this, I mean, there are so many areas that we can address on this issue, but one of the areas I would like to highlight again, is the increase in support for the legal assistance, legal aid, pro bono legal services, as well as funding for protections and legal aid. So since I took a lot of time, I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing further on this issue. I mean, we may be like, okay, I say legal aid, although there is that just judiciary is unreliable, still there are avenues that we can find to bring about justice within the customary systems, within the local units, although we cannot rely on the national legal systems. There's a way we can find relief and recovery and justice within the local unit, because Myanmar is very complex, and the junta doesn't have control over the entire country. So that's one option we're looking at. The second option is that the international justice processes, there has been several international justice processes underway, ongoing, and we can also explore other international justice mechanisms for these atrocity crimes, the crimes that the religious persecutions in Myanmar has led to the commissions of the atrocity crimes, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and that include the sexual violence. And although there are a few cases, ongoing investigations on by the ICC, and we have one universal jurisdictions, but I think exploring options for the women survivors, or in other courts, or preparing or having a preparatory plan to bring about justice for the women survivors itself will be critical, and it's critical, and that's where we need support, legal support for the women survivors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wei Wei, for that powerful testimony and for bringing to us those highlights from the Asian region and specifically from Myanmar. Your remarks remind us how deeply a culture of impunity can undermine access to justice, and also like the disproportionate impact that the lack of legal services may have on women from religious minorities. You have also highlighted the issue of sexual violence, which is usually one of the tactics of intimidation against women, while survivors face stigma, pressure to remain silent, and re-victimization with justice systems that lack independence and impartiality. It's also very interesting how you have mentioned the role of women-led organizations and how they have continued to play a crucial role in documenting abuses and supporting survivors and pressing for accountability, as well as the importance of strengthening local community systems, which are perhaps the part of that support network that women belonging to religious minorities can have. Now I would like to, so thank you very much, Wei Wei, for your intervention. And now I would like to pass the floor to Funke Aduye from Hope Behind Bars, Africa. Welcome, Funke.
Thank you, Viviana. Yes. All right. Good day, everyone. Thank you once again, Viviana, and everyone at FOB Women for setting up this very important conversation. I should say a very big thank you as well to Professor Dania for the insightful keynote speech, and also to Wewe for sharing perspectives from Asia. So my name is Funke Adeoye. I've been working on issues relating to access to justice and just strengthening the criminal justice system in Nigeria for about 12 years now. And within the short time that we have, I will just do a quick overview of the characteristics of the justice systems in Africa, and then, FORB. And then I would speak to the barriers women face in accessing justice in Nigeria, women from minority groups, using Nigeria as a case study. And I would round up with recommendations that I believe can help us move the needle. So just looking at the justice system in Africa generally, it's characterized by a pluralistic hybrid nature, where we have a mix of both formal system, community-based customary system, and also some bit of colonial inherited legal system. A good number of African countries still have challenges with limited resources, with high caseloads, with executive influence, with the fact that the judiciary system is not particularly independent. And we also find that even though we have the formal courts, we also still have some legacy, some colonial legacy within our systems. In terms of the protection of freedom of religion within Africa, we do know that a lot of the African constitutions have provisions that protect freedom of religion, and a good number of them have also signed the ICCPR Article 18 on FORB. And so what we have in terms of freedom of religion, or the challenges we have in terms of freedom of religion within Africa, is characterized mostly by the rising state of dominant religions, surging violent extremism, which we do know that largely impacts women. We also see a lot of minority women who face compounded discrimination. They experience restrictions on movement. They also experience elevated risk of gender-based violence, which mostly is driven by patriarchal interpretations of religious doctrine. In Nigeria, what we have seen over time is that we have very structural and economic barriers to formal justice for women. And I think this is, while I would be speaking to Nigeria and be sharing examples from Nigeria, I do know that this applies to other countries within Africa as well. And I think even as we had mentioned, it's something that you find in most countries within the global south. We find situations whereby women lack financial access to access courts, lawyers, sustain litigation processes, and which most times you find that women from minority communities are mostly marginalized. By virtue of the work that I do, we mostly do a lot of work around providing access to justice to this kind of women, that's women from minority communities. And you find that, as simple as even engaging the court, the formal court system, a lot of these women don't even have the space to do that. And this oftentimes is compounded by the fact that some of them lack education. They lack literacy, they lack education, and they also lack literacy with respect to their rights. And when you look at some of the instances that we have had, some of the cases that we have had, you find that even some of the cases out there goes to show how even after some of these women access justice, they would eventually not be able to, they would not get accountability. So a very good example would be the case of Deborah Yakubu. Deborah Yakubu was a young girl who had posted something on a group, and she was lynched. She was lynched for religious reason. They said she had committed blasphemy, and she died. And what we found is that even though the faces of her perpetrators were out there in a video, it's on social media, they were never held accountable for their crimes. In fact, even though they had committed murder, they were actually, I think they were actually charged for a very bailable offense. And eventually, after lots of adjournments, what happened is they were set free. And that registered a major thing in the minds of people out there, because this was a sensational case. People, there was a lot of outrage online in courts and all of that, but still, I think it's more than 4 years now, and she never got justice. And so the question for most women in minority communities is, if someone like Deborah and her parents never got justice, what's my fate if I get to engage the justice system? Now, that takes me to the second barrier that I think women in minority communities face with respect to access to justice, and that's the fact that there is a large distrust in our justice institutions. I think we mentioned, and also Professor Naz also mentioned something around the fact that a lot of our judiciaries are not independent, right? People don't, the judiciary or the justice system is supposed to be there for the average and common man. But in reality, what we find is there is a huge distrust in the justice system. There's a huge distrust in the justice institutions because the executive branch wields a lot of power over these institutions. And then also, we've also had instances where, just like Deborah's case, she had a right to justice. I mean, her family members, everyone had a right to knowing that, the people who perpetrated the crime against her were held accountable, but it never happened. Now, what actually happened is we saw somebody else, also a very highly sensational case, Rhoda Jattau, who was actually arrested and imprisoned for 18 months simply because she spoke about Deborah's case. And this was one case we were very involved in. There were threats to her life. There were threats to the life of the lawyers. There was a lot of advocacy that had to go on for her to eventually be released after 18 months. So there's a high distrust in the justice system that even makes reporting very hard. And that, for me, is the third point. The fact that first of all, there is the barrier to reporting in the sense that women don't even know, women in minority communities don't even know where to go to report, but they don't even feel safe when they go to report any kind of issue that is perpetrated against them. And then the fact that it also feels like there's a criminalization of peaceful expression. When you speak about these issues as a woman, you're seen as the outcast. You could be arrested, you could be detained, you could be held for months. And at the end of the day, the woman and her family is the one who gets to be blamed. I think there's also the conversation around the limited access to legal aid. That's why we do the work that we do. And I often say that if the government and the justice system was doing its work, organizations like mine would not exist. Nigeria has a legal aid council. A lot of African countries have councils that are supposed to provide legal aid to minority individuals, minority women. But unfortunately, while those things are there, they are not there in practice. They are there theoretically, but they don't necessarily function in practice. And I think finally on the barriers, it's just to speak more about the fact that a lot of cases go underreported, right? A lot of cases go underreported. The women are afraid, even oftentimes when we try to engage journalists to go to some communities in the northern part of the country to interview and to get facts on certain stories that come to us, the journalists are afraid for their life. And so a lot of cases actually go underreported. There are lots of forced abduction cases relating to freedom of religion that go underreported. There are lots of cases where the norms that come out of certain religions are affecting women negatively, and it's going underreported. Why? Because people, journalists, even activists are also scared for their life. And I think that this is one thing that we really need to highlight. So I'll just quickly summarize what I think we could do to move the needle. And there are lots of things, right? There are lots of things. We could talk about the legal and institutional reforms, but I really want to talk about something that I have seen work a bit, even though it's just moving the needle. And that is while we have spoken, or why I have spoken a lot about about the formal justice system, it's important that we situate this conversation within the purview of the communities, because at the end of the day, a lot of these women in minority communities would remain in those communities. They were born in those communities, they were married into those communities, and whatever religious beliefs or whatever it is that that community holds, it's something that they would always carry with them. And so can we begin to talk about this issue and engage community leaders, engage religious leaders? In the part of the country where I come from, people or rather in the part of Africa where I come from, I think a lot of Africans, people always talk about how we are big on faith. And so can we take some of the things that we really hold there in terms of strengthening freedom of religion to the communities, engage the community leaders, because in some way, they also provide some form of justice. I didn't get to talk so much about the customary system and the informal system and how, even reporting to the traditional leaders or religious leaders, and then they escalating that sort of thing. Well, I think that that's something that I think would predominantly move the needle in the minority communities. And then one final one is the fact that we need to strengthen prosecution and accountability mechanisms. If we don't do that, then, people or women would not think that access to justice is available for them. They would continually be distrusting the system. There would continually be that fear of reporting. But when we begin to strengthen prosecution, when prosecution begins to understand the need to protect women, beginning from the police, because it's even before it gets to the court, right? It begins from the police, from the process of reporting, from the fact that they are not re-traumatized when they engage with the police. All of that needs to be strengthened. And I think that if we can come up with, a holistic, low-hanging fruit ways that we can strengthen our prosecution to understand these issues and the need for them to also protect the rights of women in minority groups, vis-a-vis, their rights to freedom of religion. I think that's something that could also predominantly move the needle. Thank you. I did 11 minutes, 10. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Funky, for your intervention. As you has mentioned, even though Nigeria, for instance, has ratified different instruments and the rights are perhaps in the constitution, there's still a gap between law and in practice, and women from religious minority communities frequently facing compounded forms of discrimination, are facing structural barriers that make justice extremely difficult to access. Many women lack the financial means, legal literacy, or educational opportunities needed to navigate the court system, while distrust in judicial institutions and limited independence of the judiciary further undermine accountability. As you also pointed out, serious violations such as forced abductions and other abuses often remain underreported, in part because of survivors facing stigma and pressure not to speak out. You also highlighted the importance of engaging community leaders and avoid re-victimization. So thank you very much for a great presentation. And now I would like to pass the floor to Teresa Flores from the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America. Welcome, Teresa. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Viviana. Thank you very much to the panelists for these incredible insights. I think it's important to have this kind of conversations. And when we discuss access to justice for women from religious minorities, the Latin American context presents some particular dynamics. Unlike other regions, the main barriers to justice do not usually stem from explicit legal restrictions on freedom of religion or beliefs, but instead they are linked to broader structural conditions. We can mention a weak rule of law, high levels of violence, social inequality, and entrenched discrimination. So across the region, across Latin America, in general, legal frameworks formally recognize freedom of religion or belief. And many states also are parties to international human rights treaties. Despite this scenario, despite these warranties, women connected to religious communities continue to face serious obstacles when seeking justice. And in this environment, women connected to religious communities often experience overlapping vulnerability. So globally, women and girls, we know that they already face many disadvantages in different settings, in social, economic, and political life. So when the religious dimension is added, especially in contexts where a religious identity or practice become contested, additional forms of discrimination and violence may arise. So in addition, these forms or the forms that persecution takes can differ for women. And Wei and Funke already mentioned this, but these kind of violations might include coercion, social exclusion, sexual violence, and other pressures linked to family honor, to social reputation. And because these violations often occur within families or within communities, they are less likely to be reported or prosecuted, which creates significant barriers to justice. But at the same time, vulnerability in Latin America does not always comes from belonging to a demographic religious minority per se. So in fact, for instance, here in Latin America, most women in the region identify as Christian. However, a Christian woman might still become targets because of their religious behavior. That is their visible participation in religious life. This can include evangelization, community leadership, humanitarian initiatives, or public expressions of faith. So when women become visible or visible actors within religious communities, their activities might challenge political authorities, might challenge criminal groups, or local power structures. And in these situations, it is often this visibility, not minority status itself, that can trigger intimidation or that can trigger retaliation. So this dynamic becomes particularly evident in authoritarian contexts, where state institutions themselves might be implicated in violations. In countries like Cuba or Nicaragua, documented cases show that women connected to Christian communities, particularly those perceived as politically dissenting, have faced surveillance, harassment, arbitrary detention, and they have suffered restriction on their religious practice. In Cuba, for instance, women associated with movements such as the Ladies in White, as well as Catholic lay leaders or parish volunteers in Nicaragua, have been detained while attempting to attend religious services or questioned by security agents because of their links to imprisoned relatives, clergy members, or civic activism. So in this context, religious activity can easily become intertwined with political labeling, exposing women to reprisals such as travel bans, confiscation of property, and even forced exile. Also, another aspect that it is important to mention is that, for instance, women's detainees and female relatives of religious leaders have reported gender-specific forms of abuse. This includes sexual harassment, degrading body searches during prison visits, and other forms of humiliation intended to intimidate families and discourage public advocacy. As a consequence, these dynamics create serious barriers to justice because the very institutions responsible for investigating these abuses, police, prosecutors, courts, etc., are often directly involved in the violations themselves. Other contexts, apart from Cuba and Nicaragua, we can mention, for instance, the context of organized crime. Organized criminal groups or armed groups that exercise territorial control might also target women connected to religious communities. In countries like Colombia or Mexico, women connected to religious communities might also become targets of organized criminal groups that exercise territorial control. Women involved in church ministries or community outreach programs might face threats when their activities challenge criminal interests, when they resist the recruitment of young people, or when these activities disrupt illegal economies. And in some documented cases, daughters of pastors also have been harassed, have been threatened in order to pressure religious leaders to abandon their ministry in the area. In addition to this dynamic, another pattern that we have observed in some indigenous communities in Mexico has to do with the issue of religious intolerance. Where religious intolerance persists and communities expect members to adhere to the same traditional religious practices, this can be a problem. Women who convert to Christianity or participate in a specific religion that doesn't follow the majority religion might face violence, might face detention by community authorities. They can be expelled from their communities. Women have been beaten, have been detained in their homes, and even their houses have been destroyed after hosting these religious gatherings. So taken together, this situation illustrates how gender, religion, and local power structures can intersect in ways that severely restrict both freedom of religion and women's access to justice. We know that from a legal perspective, the Inter-American human rights system interprets access to justice broadly. It includes not only the right to bring claims before independent courts, but also the right to obtain effective remedies when rights have been violated. However, across the region, and as other regions, as we have heard today, obstacles remain like the widespread culture of impunity. This also influencing this. And because many cases of violence against women are never properly investigated or prosecuted, victims also are often discouraged from reporting crimes. And this, of course, perpetuates cycles of violence. For women connected to religious communities, these barriers might be even more pronounced. So authorities might lack awareness of how gender-based violence intersects with religious identity or religious practice, and certain forms of persecution might not even be recognized as violations of freedom of religion or belief. For this reason, we believe that improving the availability of reliable and disaggregated data is essential. In many Latin American countries, official statistics on violence almost never include information about the religious dimension, and without data that captures both this gender and religious dimension, many patterns of violence remain invisible. And it is also important to remember that most women in the region identify as Christians, for instance, and gender-based persecution against women from religious minority is not always documented when minority status is understood only in demographic terms. As I mentioned before, risks might also arise from religious behavior. Women who actively participate in visible forms of religious life might become targets of intimidation or retaliation. So improving access to justice in the region, we think that requires recognizing how gender and freedom of religion or belief intersect in practice. And public policies therefore need to move beyond this formal legal protection and address structural conditions that limit access to justice. And this includes strengthening protection, reporting, accountability mechanisms, as Funke mentioned, and all of these. Without this perspective, many of these violations will remain invisible within existing justice system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa, for driving us through the particularities of the Latin American region concerning for violations against women. And a couple of things I would like to highlight are how women converting to a different religion, they face particular challenges also within their own communities, and how important it is improving data reliability for amplifying these cases and bring justice to women in the region. So thank you so much for a great presentation. And now I would like to pass the floor to the Special Rapporteur, to Nasila Ganea, to share some highlights and reactions from the panelists' intervention. The floor is yours, Nasila.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly mind-blowing and rich discussion. I think we all agreed on at least 5 points that I'm trying to abbreviate and capture. First is that legal frameworks must prohibit and address this intersectional discrimination, including by the review of laws that disproportionately affect minority women. As both Teresa and Weiwei said, this really needs a sober investigation of widespread cultures of impunity in various contexts. Secondly, we all agree that justice systems have to be made accessible and safe for those who seek remedies, including by strengthening confidential reporting mechanisms, expanding legal aid services, and ensuring that law enforcement and judicial actors receive training and are sensitized to these intersecting forms of discrimination. As both Weiwei and Teresa and Funke said, this means access to legal recourse without retaliation, safe channels for reporting, strengthening the legal system and the rule of law, recognizing it in different contexts. We're talking about contexts of war, of terrorist activities, of refugee and IDP camps, of places of detention. In relation to international crimes, we're talking about mixed legal systems. In all of these instances, there has to be an establishment of trust in the legal system, that reporting will not result in threats and violence, or further entrenched discrimination or reprisal attacks or surveillance. And these are, of course, incredibly important. It reminded me of one of our communications from the mandate from June 2025, where the Baha'i international community reported that 2/3 of Baha'is detained purely because of their religion in Iran were women. This is not accidental. These are targeted attacks, and the burdens of young women with children being imprisoned is heavier and specific. Thirdly, we all agreed that data and documentation is essential. Without disaggregated data, there is denial, and patterns can't be identified or effective responses designed. But and Teresa said that this is incredibly important, and of course I agree. But in some countries, it's illegal to collect data on the basis of religion. It reminds us that, of course, any data collection should be voluntary and depend on self-definition. But this is really quite an obstacle. Fourthly, we agreed on the participation and leadership of minority women. This must be central to reform efforts, and policies have to be designed with their input, with rich knowledge of the realities they face. Minority rights already calls for the inclusion of minorities in all matters that concern them. Gender rights standards do too. The reality on the ground may be that it requires resettlement, but we know how restricted visa regimes are, for example. And Teresa raised the interesting point about the public-private divide. It relates to women's rights, and it also relates to freedom of religion or belief, and we need to decipher that and understand that deeply. My report last week in Geneva was about death, freedom of religion or belief, and honoring the deceased. And even here, there are particular burdens for women, for example, regarding impurity laws and regarding widows. So, the gender dimension is often overlooked, but in every debate on freedom of religion or belief, there is a gender dimension that is to be unraveled and focused on. Finally, we agree that civil society organizations and women's human rights defenders working in this space should be protected and supported. We hope that they become unnecessary, as Funke mentioned. But as things currently stand, their advocacy is absolutely indispensable for advancing accountability and reform.
Thank you so much, Nasilia, for sharing your highlights from the fantastic presentations we're having today. And now we will transition to the open space. We will have Judy Golub taking some questions from the participants in this conversation, who will be directed to all of one of the panelists that we have. So, Judy, please, the floor is yours for doing the Q&A session.
You're on mute.
Sorry, we have several questions, but I wanted to start with one quick question for all of you to answer very quickly. It may be unfair, but what is the one most important point that each of you want to leave us with today? Let me start with Nasilia, and then I'll go to the panelists.
You can start with me, but after now, we should give more space to the other speakers. I think first and foremost, it has to be recognized. Whilst it remains invisible and under the radar, we won't be able to address it.
Wei, do you have one thing you want to leave people with? She's not there right now. Funke, what's one thing you want to leave us with?
Yes, I would say we have to find a way to address the issue of underreporting and put data at the center, because with data at the center, we would have empirical evidence to describe the weight of what we're dealing with, and then we can begin to profile adequate solution. Thank you.
Okay, Teresa?
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe that the risks do not always arise from belonging to a religious minority in demographic terms, because women, as I mentioned, might also become targets because of their visible participation in religious life.
Great. Here's a question from Blessed Prasad. Advocacy for women's rights is sometimes criticized as imposing Western frameworks. For instance, in India, when we criticize certain discriminatory laws or practices, governments or authorities often respond by saying these laws protect women from coercion and reflect local values. How can international advocates challenge such laws without reinforcing the perception that FORB advocacy is a Western agenda? Or how do we advocate for FORB and women's rights while being sensitive to cultural contexts? So this was a question directed to all of us, all the speakers in this special rapporteur. Anyone want to take that first?
I mean, Funke, you talked about the importance of national reporting or local reporting.
Yes. So that's something that I would say we get to see in our work a lot. When you do international human rights work, there is always that pushback that you're introducing Western agenda into our customary way of doing things and all. And I think that the easy way that I find is, like I said earlier, a lot of our countries within the global south have ratified the IHRL treaties, ICCPR and all of that. But we also have our constitution. So freedom of religion is protected in most of the constitution. So it's going back to what the constitution says. And then again, I will still also talk about the importance of looking at what we have in terms of even our customary platforms. When you look at most of the religions of the world, the Bible, the Quran, it actually is against discrimination in some form. And freedom of religion is protecting people's right to religion. So also finding allies within the religious communities who can properly interpret the different holy books to say, actually, our holy book does preserve the right to freedom of religion. I think that's something that could be helpful as well.
Here's another question. This is for Teresa. How can religious communities who have their own forms of authority be held accountable for things like intimidation against women in Latin America, maybe specifically Peru?
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, this is a very complex issue because community governance systems, including indigenous authorities, they do deserve recognition and respect. We know that these systems operate but we know that these systems operate within broader human rights frameworks, and these include protections for women and for freedom of religion or belief. So I think that the challenge is to find ways to ensure that these rights are protected without undermining community autonomy. So this means maybe strengthening dialogue between state institutions, community authorities, promoting awareness of human rights standards, and ensuring that women have access to different channels of protection if they experience any kind of violence or coercion or expulsion because of their religious choices. So we cannot prefer this community autonomy if these undermine human individual rights. It's a very complex balance.
Thank you. Now I have a question for Nazila. My question is regarding equality for gender differences in spiritual leadership of women, specifically women of Vietnam and Cao Dai.
I don't know if I fully understand the question, but if it's about should women have the equal rights to leadership within religious communities, I think I would go along with what Funke was suggesting, that some issues are best addressed by governmental authorities, and some issues may be more sustainably addressed and deeply addressed if we allow communities to have the opportunity for dialogue and debate within communities before the government sort of storms in and says we need to see gender equality here. I think maybe that's sufficient, but I'm not sure I understood the question properly.
I think you got it. And then one person was curious to hear the panelists and perspective on AI for legal help. Any thoughts about the use of AI? Okay.
What's the question? Because we use AI for legal help. So
Yeah,
what's the
they
question?
want to know your perspective on using AI for legal help.
Okay, that's interesting. Because we actually use, AI is a tool, just like a lot of other technological tools that has pros and cons. And for us, we have found a way to create a template whereby people can access legal support, legal information using WhatsApp chatbots. And that's because we find that a dominant number of Nigerians actually use WhatsApp, both the educated and non-educated. So I'm for AI for legal help as long as the rights, privacy rights of people using it are protected, and every other provisions relating to providing protection to the users are also respected.
That's great. So one quick question and then we'll close. Given these presentations, what kind of cross-regional solidarity can all of you envision? Any thoughts on that? And the importance of cross-regional solidarity?
Okay. So in the risk of just being the one speaking, that's one question that I was curious to get an answer to, because I would say I just fairly came into the whole space of freedom of religion as it relates to women. But I do know that in the work that I do relating to gender and death penalty, I've had to get learnings from other CSOs and communities across the world. And that the thing I kept saying about working with allies and working with community leaders, religious leaders, is something that I know had worked in fostering abolition of death penalty in certain continents. So I don't necessarily have an answer to this. I'm curious to know what Wei, Teresa, and perhaps Naz has to say. Thank you.
Wei?
Sure. Just to continue, I guess one question, I think your earlier question, I just want to add a point or two on that, on AI. I mean, we didn't discuss much about the use of AI, and it affects positively or negatively. Of course, Funke has described how it can be used for the legal services and assistance, but at the same time, I think we are seeing the growing trend of targeting religious minorities with their religious derogatory or other forms of attacks by using AI, whether altering photos and dehumanizing the other religion other than theirs. These become a trend. Even I personally receive many attacks for my activism, but then I'm targeted for my religion other than my ethnicity or my work as a human rights activist or women's rights activist. Often I'm targeted for my religion, although I try to, in my line of work, throughout my work, although I am a Rohingya and I work for the Rohingya by we work for all communities in Burma and or all religious communities as well. But then often I'm humiliated or targeted or with the religious connotations attacks by using AI, by altering photos, for example, feeding me with pork or stuff like that, like or we have also been seeing, attacks on the religious books, religious targeting religious churches. I think the use of AI and religion is a new area that I think we need to focus or study a bit more. And then there is a multisectional effect on that too. If you're being a woman, if you're religious minorities, if you're from this and that background, and if you're young, the way that the AI has been negatively affecting, it's become a serious issue for many, while the AI is used for the good of the society as well. So, but then the question is, how do we prevent and how do we minimize this attack? What kind of regulations do we require, and what kind of awareness do we require for them to minimize this risks? And then just briefly on the regional solidarity, I think human to human solidarity is the most powerful at the moment. The power of human solidarity is what we need the most when governments and the powerful actors, leaders are failing our world today. So first of all, human solidarity. Please stand up for other communities across the region and show your support. Create more collaborations and coalitions among the regional bodies and organizations so that we can learn from each other and we can enhance our activities. I think that's important. Regional coalitions, lesson learned, working groups, stuff like that are important. But at the same time, we still need to hold our leaders accountable. So oftentimes, when we see religious persecutions, persecutions against the religious minorities, it's often come from the institutions, from the governments, right? Without government's failure, these persecutions cannot be lost, right? So they are entrenched, they transform to atrocities, crime, they become serious violations because of government's active participation or failure to protect. So thus we must hold our leaders accountable, and at the regional level, there are regional intergovernmental organizations. If they are involved in this, if our country's leaders, government involved in these regional bodies, we can approach them to take actions, while UN has now become less and less effective in terms of stopping or ending violence across the world, unfortunately. So I think becoming more creative in terms of regional solidarity, regional actions, and finding more avenue to navigate this work will be, I think, a new way of our approach to advocacy.
Well, thank you, Wei Wei. We have other questions, but we've run out of time, and I want to now turn it over to Viviana to close us out. Thank you, Vivi. Thank you, Wei Wei. Thank you all, the speakers, and Viviana.
Thanks so much, Judy, and thank you all. That was a great conversation. Across the discussion today, we heard powerful examples from different regions that illustrate both the urgency of this challenge and the resilience of the women confronting it. Today's conversation has also shown us that closing the justice gap for women from religious minority communities requires concrete steps. And this is the invitation we want to leave you with today. Each of us in our own countries and contexts can help move this work forward. That may mean working to ensure that freedom of religion or belief is fully integrated into national gender equality strategies, and that FORB-related laws and policies are responsive to the specific barriers faced by women from religious minority communities. It may mean advocating for safe reporting mechanisms, legal aid systems, and psychosocial support. It may mean supporting efforts to judicial and law enforcement institutions, understand how compounded forms of discrimination based on gender and religion can create deeper barriers to remedies and reparations. And it may mean helping documenting and making visible the experiences of women from religious minority communities. And most importantly, it means ensuring these women themselves are at the center of these efforts, participating in justice reforms, shaping policies, and contributing to solutions. Looking ahead from the Women's Working Group of the Earth Roundtable, we will be coordinating efforts to advance this agenda. In particular, we will be working with partners to advocate for a general recommendation from the CEDAW Committee on Women and Freedom of Religion or Belief, which could help clarify state obligations and strengthen protections for women facing these intersecting forms of discrimination. We warmly invite those of you who are interested to join and engage with our working group so that together we can continue advancing this work beyond today's conversation. I would like to take a moment to express my sincere gratitude to all of our wonderful speakers for today for their insightful contributions. A special thank to Professor Nasila Ganea for her thoughtful reflections and leadership at the UN Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Religion or Belief, and to our regional panelists, Wei Wei Nu, Funky Adoye, and Teresa Flores, for bringing such powerful perspectives from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I would also like to thank Judy Golub and the For Women Alliance, as well as the many organizations that supported this initiative and contributed to the written statement submitted to the commission, and of course to the First Freedom Foundation for your great support. Thank you so much. So thank you, Judy. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Patrice. And thank you so much to the wonderful interpreter, Laura, for making possible the engagement of our participants from Latin America. And of course, a massive thanks to all of you for joining this conversation. Thank you very much. And see you next time.
Thank you.